Hello and welcome to the Problem Gambling Podcast. I'm Barry Grant, an addiction counselor with Extern Problem Gambling, and my co-host is Tony O'Reilly, also an addiction counselor and gambling harm prevention
Blah blah
facilitator,
blah blah
blah
blah.
blah stuff. Where he goes out to schools. That's mostly what Tony is doing these days, providing psychoeducation on gambling harm prevention to young people all around the country. And especially in Wicklow, where that's where one of our main pieces of funding comes from, my old neck of the woods up around Bray and up that area. Anyway, blah blah blah.
Exactly.
Today, if you've ever listened before, you know who we are. I don't know why I do
Mm.
this every week, but
Yeah.
you could be a new listener, and
You should just record it and just play it at the start.
yeah, that would make sense.
Yes.
So this week we thought we would do something on self-compassion. I was talking to a mate of mine recently, and we trained together. Jesus, 19 years ago, we started training together as counselors, addiction counselors. And he was saying, like, his last 10 years in private practice, he's gone away from addictions altogether. And his main focus of his work is self-compassion, no matter what the presenting issue is. I'm going, how the hell are you doing that self-compassion? I was like, 10 years, okay, right. So I better look into this a bit more, and looked into it a little bit and did the self-compassion self-test, which takes about 10 minutes. It's going to be on the link to the website that we will put in the show notes. And my self-compassion was scoring very low. I don't know. Did you do the self-test
I
on
did
your?
it. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
scoring very high actually.
Oh, look at you.
Yeah, no, and I was surprised when I got the results in. I think it was a four out of. I
Yeah,
think
that's
it's
good.
yeah. So I was a bit surprised, but I think it depends where I am at the moment when I'm doing the test. I think the test is very much um my kind of take on is where I am at the time, and I think at the moment I'm able to probably look at things very pragmatically, kind of take a step back from it. Now, I could do that and I could get a text message out of the blue from someone or even a post on internet saying you're this, that, and the other because of the gambling.
Mhm.
And you go into that cycle of self-loathing and all this kind of stuff. So I think if it depends when you do it. Now, I think yesterday, even though I wasn't feeling the best, I think when I done it yesterday evening, I probably was in a good headspace, and I think that's probably helpful. I think when the questions in general, I have a good way of processing stuff and bringing it back. I think I've learned that through therapy over the years, through GA
Mhm.
meetings, through sharing the story and lessening that shame and stigma I feel most of the time. Now, that comes in every so often for various reasons, but I think I'm able to kind of very much get my head around it. I've learned that emotional regulation piece, I think, as well. It's part of my work, but also how I keep myself kind of between those two lines of your window of tolerance, that I'm able to process things a bit differently when I'm not so much overwhelmed or underwhelmed or shut off emotionally. And I think that's for me the self-compassion bit was, yeah, the thought and coming, but I can very much using CBT techniques, which kind of linked to the third part is I think I'm able to kind of reframe it, reprocess it a lot quicker than I would have in the early recovery, I think.
Yeah. And that's great. Yeah, definitely it's a snapshot in time. Like it's
Mm,
not this global thing. You know, you do one of these tests and you could be in a bad headspace. You could be under a lot of stress at the time. And yeah, I thought
like
it
the
was
wheel of life,
interesting.
isn't it? The wheel of life
Yeah.
is like that. You know that when you look at your life as a full, if you could do it one week, it could be everything's wrong. Do it another week, everything could be a lot better. So I think it's good. I think it's good to maybe do the test every so often and see where you are with
Mhm.
it because I think that your recovery can grow that way as well. So
Yeah, and not just for people in recovery. I mean, for family members as well. We might touch on
mm,
that a bit. Other concerned persons who've been affected by somebody else's gambling, like that compassion piece and self-compassion piece is really important, you know.
yeah,
And that's I think that's why my colleague can use it for anything and everything. You know, it's not just okay, obviously our podcast say most of the people who listen to it are people who are either in recovery from gambling problem or trying to get into recovery, but there will be quite a few family members who would listen
mm,
in as well and get something from it. But okay, so and actually you touched on something that I was thinking we might do for another episode when you were
oh
talking
no,
about you know, if you're in a good day and you're kind of between these kind of in your window of tolerance,
mm,
but then something could kind of throw you off kilter, you know, get a text message from somebody or somebody makes a negative comment online. And I don't know if you've looked into any of this internal family systems. It's called parts work.
I would have years ago would have done a
Yeah,
bit on it. Yeah, I think in
yeah,
training, but also in a little bit of work years ago in Ballymun, I would have done a little bit on it as well. But that emotional regulation piece is how any if many of my clients listen, they'll know it's something I talk about a lot. But it's also how I try to live my life. I kind of gauge how I am today. If I'm feeling a bit low myself, what's going on? How can I self-regulate or relational regulate? I think it's a very good tool to have there as gauging where you are at any one point, but also saying it's okay to feel overwhelmed. It's okay to feel shut down emotionally. And what can I do proactively to make sure that I don't go out or don't go out too often. But when I am out there, the whole thing is if you're out there for a length of time, it's about getting yourself back inside your window of tolerance,
mm,
using different regulation skills. It's a big part of my recovery. Even to this day, 15 years into it, it's kind of a big part. It's about recognizing the body sensations, the thoughts, the feelings, and having plans in place. Yeah, so again, I don't want to dip into that episode, but that's it's
yeah.
definitely something that I thought we would have done something that before. We probably did touch on it or talked about it, I think, during different episodes. But
I don't think so because I'm only kind of dipping my toe into it, and I don't want to go off on a mad tangent here. But
mm,
yeah, they call it parts work, and they have this
yeah,
idea there's exile parts. So somebody says something negative, and that obviously we'll touch on this today. If we're looking at it mindfully, that's just a thing that's happening right now.
yeah,
That if we look at it completely mindfully, that's a thing that's happening right now. But the mind and the body don't work that way. The mind and the body can make patterns out of things, and they don't just look at the thing that's happening right now. They bring you back to all the similar kind of things.
bridge effect, yeah, back,
Yeah,
yeah,
kind of like that, all the way back to
yeah.
your early childhood, right? And they call those the exile parts in internal family systems.
And a good
So,
example of that as well, whenever we are talking about. So yeah,
yeah,
so it's
yeah.
something we'll touch on.
And then you touched on something else that they talk about in IFS. It's these protector parts. You've got the
Yeah.
managers that's proactive, being proactive about
Mm,
how do I regulate emotions? And then you got the firefighter parts. And we, in our work, are seeing the firefighter parts most of the time
yeah,
because the firefighter says, do something quick, quick fix, something that I know from previous experience works quickly and effectively. Gambling, drink, drugs,
yeah,
pornography, gaming, whatever. Get the quick fix in there. The house is about to burn down. Don't be proactive. Don't be looking at the big picture. The house is on fire. Quick, boom, do something fast,
yeah,
right? And again, in that model, they say there are no bad parts. So the firefighter is not a bad part. It's just doing what it knows how to do,
mm,
which is knee-jerk reactions, act quickly, find the most effective tool. You know it's effective because you used it before in the
yeah,
past and it worked. Bang, right? And the healthier option is the proactive one.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I remember being at a Suicide to Survive workshop years ago, which is about mindfulness. And I remember they were saying like, in Eastern medicine, people go to the doctor when they're well. So it's very much like a proactive thing,
Mm.
where in Western medicine we go when we're nearly our, arms,
Yeah.
legs, whatever, falling off. And I think that it is good to have that firefighting element in it because again, it's emotional regulation, but also it's good to have things in place that you're doing proactively, whether it's mindfulness, which is touched on in this, whether it's um mindfulness, it could be the gym, it could be mental health, it could be exercise, stuff that kind of make sure we're kind of in the best possible frame of mind as we can be. Getting kind of brain fog here. But the whole idea of all this, like for the motion regulation piece, is that we often feel better or feel able to regulate emotions when we're not shut down emotionally, when we're not overtired, overstressed. So if we can have things in place that lessen the tiredness, lessen the stress we have, and that's things you can do on a day-to-day basis, like taking 5 minutes out of your day just to kind of switch off from stuff, putting away the phone earlier at night, stuff like this. If you're proactive in that way, when you do meet these problems, you're kind of hitting it with a little bit more ammunition rather
Mm.
than the firefighting afterwards. I think that's the whole idea of the regulation piece is not to regulate after the fact, it's to have things in place as well so that you're kind of hitting it at a better headspace. And I often found that a lot of the things I had to face over the years in recovery, a lot of the fallout stuff, when I was engaged in, Gamblers Anonymous at the start, when I was engaged in therapy or more engaged in, you know, being connected to friends, even when you do meet these stuff that come at you out of the blue, you're just better prepared for them. And then to have the skills as well, or the tools, as to say, or for that fallout piece as well. I think it's a balance of both, isn't it? I think that's probably what you're kind of saying. That it's good to have the firefighting part, but it's also good to have the manager part, be prepared for all eventualities. I think to have a blend of that, I think it's very important.
Yeah, and maybe part of recovery is giving the firefighter other quick fix tools
Yeah.
that don't involve super addictive stuff, really
Yeah.
unhealthy stuff, Anyway, we've gone way off on a tangent, but like
No, that's okay
ultimate,
too, though. Yeah,
yeah,
it's
yeah,
good to kind of pull apart because I think they're all
yeah, of
interlinked anyway. But it's
course,
good.
yeah.
Yeah.
Because if we have compassion towards ourselves, we can have compassion towards that exiled part from our childhood. We can look at that compassionately and
Mm,
mindfully, which we'll touch on today, and we can have compassion towards the firefighter, and we can, we can. There's a whole lot of stuff in IFS. I won't go. I'll go in a real tangent here, but we can have compassion towards the firefighter and say, okay, I understand why you're doing what you're doing, and there are no bad parts. You're doing it for
mm,
the benefit of me, but you need to stand down and let the manager be proactive. And if there's a real life-threatening situation, of course you're there ready to go, firefighter, and come on in and use
yeah.
all your firefighting tools. And to be compassionate towards all of these parts,
Mm.
what they would call it in parts work. Anyway, we'll get on to this.
Yeah, it's an
Compassion.
interesting, but it's
Yeah.
interesting though, isn't it? It's an interesting thing too, because I think if we can have, again, you were talking about tools, if we can have all these kind of analogies and also visuals, like a firefighter is very visual as well. It does help us to have things in place to to kind of present to clients or to present to people on the podcast who are in recovery, because every single thing that you have, like I know I done a few notes on in preparation. Would you believe I've actually done preparation for today? In preparation for today, because usually I wing it. And it's something like I will definitely introduce the client work. I'll probably do it today. Like it's something that very much an important part is definitely self-kindness. And it's something that a lot of people I know from my own experience, but also from other people who shared their experiences with me over the years, is that's a big roadblock at the start in recovery, that's self-kindness, because that self-loathing is very much there. So I think it is important to kind of name it, visualize it, and again, very much like that CBT work, you're reframing how you're thinking about yourself in recovery, how you're thinking about yourself while you're in active addiction. You won't always get it 100% right, as we know, but if you are reconditioning the brain to think that way, when all these things do pop up in your life, it can help to just lessen the impact of that thought or that feeling in that moment, just from maybe a 10 to a 7. That's what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Okay, so you touched on the first one there. Just for context, all of this stuff comes from a website called self-compassion.org. It's Dr. Kristin Neff. She's like the god of this kind of self-compassion space, from what I can tell. And she has broken this model down into three parts, which is great because most kind of psychological
Mm.
models are just way too many moving
Yeah.
parts. So three parts is relatively easy to remember and to try and incorporate into your thinking and your
Mm.
self-care. So the first part is self-kindness, which you spoke about, versus self-judgment. And look, you see this all the time. You don't have to be a person in recovery. You don't even have to be a person, a concerned person, a family member, a loved one of somebody in recovery. This is just anybody and everybody, right? Self-judgment is this, some of the, we've spoken before about the wisdom of some of the stuff from the 12-step meetings. A lot
Mm.
of it is not in any of the literature. Like it's not in the big book of AA or some of these things. In some of the meetings, they say, put down the baseball bat and pick up a feather. If you're going to beat yourself up with something, make it something gentle,
Feel
right?
yourself.
Tickle yourself. Yeah. So like put down the baseball bat. That's a good place to start. You don't have to pick up any feathers or anything that you don't need. Right. But step one, put down the baseball bat,
Can be
which
difficult. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Because sometimes we really think and feel that we deserve a good kicking and we're the worst in the world, which is the next step we'll have a look at. We kind of
Mm.
isolate ourselves from our common humanity, which is something else that she speaks about. And we go, I am the worst in the world. Therefore, I deserve to get this kicking, even if we've got very supportive people around us and we've got people telling us that they love us and care for us and all these kind things, that stuff quite often doesn't filter through. And we've touched on this in a previous episode as well, because we have some core beliefs there. And a core belief from this is a concept from cognitive behavioral therapy. A common one might be, I'm not worthy. Common core belief, I'm less than, I'm unlovable, right? So if all the people around you are telling you how much they love you, but you have a core belief that you're unlovable, well, you just see that as lies, or you see them as stupid or something, because how could they love somebody who at their core is unlovable, right? And we get into these negative, judgmental spirals. Now, the flip side of that as well is, can we truly be non-judgmental of others if we're really harshly judgmental towards ourselves?
Difficult. I think that's the whole thing. I remember I've mentioned this before, and at the risk of repeating myself, I remember going into Cumbera on the first day when I went to the treatment, and no, I was coming on the back of feeling very much judged myself, but also being judged in the media, being judged by, I was seeing as everyone was judging me. And the thing that kind of helped me was sitting in a room where I felt I wasn't being judged. And I think it kind of helped me to kind of reframe a little bit of it, that maybe I didn't have to judge myself as hard, especially for the next 12 weeks, come in with an open mind. I think I think I mentioned in the book as well, it's a huge part of the first step of that journey, because I was going in there full of fear. I was going in there full of anxiety, full of what's this going to be? Because I've heard stories about what it was and what it wasn't. But I think that whole non-judgmental piece in that moment really helped, because you will judge yourself more than anyone else, in early recovery especially. And then other people will judge and will make comments or post stuff or whatever that might be, and that will reinforce your own feeling. Like what you're saying, it'll reinforce your own feeling. Probably opposite what you're saying about someone saying they love you. It'll reinforce your own feeling of I'm not good enough, I'm shit, I'm this and that because of what I done. And that's what they say, like the one few notes I wrote, I got kind of bits and pieces. It said I can acknowledge what I've done without destroying myself. But sometimes in gambling recovery, we're so used to being in that chaos of gambling and all that goes with it. It's very hard to be in a place where you can take yourself from that, settle your mind and say, right, I'm okay here. I'm not going to judge myself today, because that quiet mind sometimes can be a scary place. And we end up going back into disruptive behaviors. You will see a lot of people in recovery who have stopped gambling, will go back to shopping. I've mentioned a lot, pornography, escorts, Tinder, whatever else it might be. That self-destructive behavior, that risky behavior as well. So that's the whole, I think, like that self-judgment it says here, like can become absolutely brutal. And it is like that. My journals from the first 7 weeks of Conver were just judgment on myself, judgment, judgment. Something clicked to me week 5. It's called unconditional love in it. It's a strange name for this week, but it is about self-compassion. And I remember I mentioned this before, Liam, the counselor, focused in on me that day because he saw I was hiding behind everything. I was hiding in my own shame, my own judgment of himself. And he focused on me for the meeting, it was a big group meeting. And I remember going for a walk afterwards, and it was that kind of, I always say, like, very funny story. And I went for a walk, broke down in the oratory in a Thai afterwards. It's that kind of, there was such a release of emotion saying, like, I can't forgive myself for what I've done. It was a big moment. And then, of course, I mentioned this epiphany in the next meeting. And one lad turned around, very droll, and he said, Tony, you're a great lad, able to forgive yourself for stealing 1.75 million, aren't you? But even in that moment, I felt, now again, we laughed, we still laugh about today, myself and that fella. But even in that moment of walking around the garden after that meeting, I think it was the first time in probably 3 months, the months before I went into Cumbria, in the 5 weeks I was there, that I felt that maybe I can go on this journey of self-forgiveness. And I'll always say, like, I had to learn in the next 7 or 8 weeks and in the next 7 or 8 months, 7 or 8 years, that I had to separate who I believe I am as a person from my actions in addiction. I think that self compassion piece, or that self kindness, is a big part of that journey. But then you will have reminders, the bank statements. It could be an argument because you can't go on a holiday for 3 or 4 years because of the finances. It could be in a strange family, you're getting messages or you're getting seeing stuff online or comments or whatever it might be that will bring you back, that bridge effect, as you mentioned, will bring you right back to that self-loathing. So you have to recondition your thinking to, right, I felt that, I see that, but I can also choose to think a different way about it and get back onto that self-compassion um, journey again.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's it's that thing of, putting down the baseball bat, and allowing yourself to forgive yourself and to be kind to yourself, which is
Mm.
not easy.
Jesus, not
Because we
nice.
have these weird expectations of ourselves that, we touched on this on a previous episode, the
Yeah,
tyranny of the shoulds and musts. I must always
yeah,
be good. I must always be perfect. I should do this. I should do that. And there's no acceptance. There tends to be very little acceptance from us, the individual, that we are just as flawed as everybody else on the planet.
yeah,
So there's an old counseling trick. You've probably used it yourself over the years. Person comes in, they're in some sort of a dilemma, should I leave my partner, whatever it might be, or quit my job, something. And they're stuck. And a good way to help a person become less stuck is say, okay, if your best friend was in an identical situation, what advice would you give to them? And they
mm,
go, well, I'd say, leave your partner because it's a toxic relationship, whatever it might be. And when you put it outside yourself, if you had a friend or a loved one who had done all the things that you yourself have done, listener, that you are angry with yourself about, that you judge yourself about, would you be as harsh on them as you're being on yourself? Now, the vast, vast, vast majority of people would not be. They would
mm.
have much more forgiveness in their hearts for another person who did the exact same things. Right?
Yeah, you will also see that in when people don't want to tell friends or family around gambling addiction, which is a big part. I'm sure you see it in your homework. I don't want to tell my friends for fear of judgment or fear of being ostracized or whatever it might be. I think there's always expectation of, I would say to them then, what if it was a friend of yours, what would, no, how would you react to my side? I'd say to them, fair dues for coming out and talking about it and being open about it. But we tend not to be able to see that in ourselves. There's always that fear of the consequences, inverted commas, of coming out and saying, yes, I have a gambling issue. And I think that's where, again, by doing a bit of reading around this, that's why it's so important through podcasts, through what's going to happen when the regulation's fully in. There's going to be more talk about gambling addiction and gambling recovery. I think it's already happening over the last number of years, is to lessen that stigma around it so that people are, feeling okay to kind of come out and say, I have an issue here. Because the whole attitude around gambling addiction and how it's portrayed even in the films and how it's portrayed sometimes it does add to that feeling of that self-judgment, like even some of the stuff like some of the notes I wrote down, like taking responsibility and attacking yourself are not the same thing. Like self-kindness doesn't mean saying what I did doesn't matter. It means like what happened mattered, but I don't have to hate myself because of it. But that's a very hard thing to do in
Mm,
recovery when there's a lot of moving parts in your own mind, but also moving parts in family, in the fallout of your behavior, the fallout of you know, especially financial fallout that can be there for years afterwards. There's constant reminders each year. And then say like, self-judgment could be I lost X amount, I'm an idiot. You kind of replace that with self-kindness if you can. Like I made decisions that cause serious harm. I need to take responsibility for those decisions, but I also need to give myself the opportunity to change. I think going into kind of Gamblers Anonymous meetings at the start, I think it touches on this in the second part as well. It's kind of, I think it gives you that reassurance that you're not the only one in this. I think that's more on the third point, but
mm,
it gives you that reassurance that, yeah, I made mistakes, but I can come out the far side of this. And then you'll hear other people's testimonies, how they made mistakes and how where they are at the moment. I think that's why Gamblers Anonymous meetings are so important because they give you a snapshot of what life can be like if you stay in recovery. Things will change because in that moment for that first meeting you ever attend, it's like, I'm fucked. Everything's going to be like this for the rest of my life. We have to kind of learn to kind of learn to think like or to tell ourselves that things will get better. And that I think adds to self-compassion, self-kindness, I think.
yeah, it is really important. I suppose that the meetings, so we'll move on to the second point.
Mm,
The meetings are really kind of touch on this, where it's the second point that Kristin Neff makes here
Yes.
is common humanity versus isolation. So when you're in isolation, you're in active addiction, you think most people think I'm the worst in the world. I know that there's all these people out there, Dustin McConville, Paul Merson, yourself, all these people who kind of come out and tell their stories. And I know all those people got into recovery from very kind of extreme places or very
Mm,
severe places, but not me because I'm special. I'm especially bad. I'm especially unfixable. And that isolation as well can play a part. I touched on this before, I think that exceptionalism for people with gambling. Like, I understand that almost everybody who gambles loses money, but I'm the exception to the rule. So you isolate yourself in
mm,
other ways as well. Like, all these other people out there, they're mugs, they're going to lose all their
yeah.
money, but I'm special. I've lost lots of money already, but I did win money before, and I'm going to
Yeah.
win back all the money that I'm lost. I
Mm,
know loads of people have tried that before and failed.
yeah.
If you're listening to this podcast, you've heard that story many times. But I've isolated myself from the rest of the herd, from my common humanity, and I go, I'm especially bad, or I'm especially good enough to buck the trend and beat the system and
Yeah.
do the thing that millions of gamblers have tried over the years and failed at. So the isolation thing can work in a lot of different
Mm.
unhealthy ways. It's a lot of different unhealthy ways.
But
Sorry.
also, sorry, but not sorry, just my ADHD had coming in. I had to nearly jumping over you. But that also comes in meetings as well, where you're even in a meeting where you're trying to get help and support. It's kind of like, oh, sure, I'm not as bad as him, or or I'm worse than him. I remember ego still full of me going into a tie, thinking, sure, I'm a lot worse than all these lads in here. Sure, I've done this. I think it's after you kind of a few weeks into the meetings, you kind of, you do get you do get that the common bond between like, as I always say, 90% of stories overlap. It's still a lot of psychology is the same, and it's kind of like the Gamblers Anonymous meetings, or even sometimes when people reach out to myself, because they know I've been through it, they kind of it's that thing of, well, he'll get it, he'll know what. You'll often hear that in addiction counseling. You have to see someone who's been through it. I don't agree with that, but sometimes that belief is there that if I know that that person's gone through it, they will get some of the struggles I'm going through. Even though each recovery, as we know, is individual, each person is individual. But that whole idea of that collective, I think that's why the Gamblers Anonymous can work, or reaching out and connecting to a counselor can work, or having a family member who kind of gets it as well in different ways at home. It's that thing of you're not doing it alone. You're coming out of isolation, because it's the one thing that even many years in recovery, I still cope by going into isolation. It's my coping skill. And it's like, it's where I'm comfortable a lot of time is when I'm isolated from everyone. I can switch off emotionally in a room. I think you've pointed out to me a lot of times I could be on Zoom meetings and like kind of, you just see the glaze look. And that's not because of this, it's just, it's me kind of, it's my head kind of could be thinking about something that's going on and just shutting down emotion in that moment. And I'm lethal for it at home as well, and I have it's something I'm working on. But it is a place I go to as a protective factor as well. So it's kind of, and again, it goes back to that emotion regulation piece. Um, but again, just to kind of denote it, like my gambling behavior did cause serious problems, but I'm not the only person who has struggled, made mistakes, or found themselves trapped in something they could not control. It's so important that common humanity piece is not an excuse. It's also isn't that other people gamble too, so it's okay. It's the again, sorry for reading from my notes. It's I'm not alone experiencing vulnerability, or I don't have to deal with my recovery in isolation. And I'll always say that when you're in recovery, the more connected you are to yourself first and foremost, but also to family members, which can be difficult in some situations, to a meeting, to it could be a group of friends that you've reconnected with, to a counselor, the more connections you have, or the more focus and the more drive you have in recovery, the better chance you have of not falling into that isolation piece, which is a breeding ground for the mind to go back into old um coping skills like, if I could just have a few bets, that makes me feel better. So that whole connection piece, and people, so some people can struggle with that piece because their coping skill for so long has just been themselves and the behavior of gambling. So to reconnect with people can be very difficult. It's something I struggled with at the start, but it's something I'm a little bit better with now. Um, but it's so important that not be in that isolation recovery.
Yeah, and it reminds me that was it Johan Hari had that thing, the opposite of addiction is connection.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when we're isolated, it's so easy because being in isolation, it can be a coping mechanism for some people. I would do it as well, for sure.
Mm.
And it can be useful. I mean, we need time for privacy
Yeah,
and we need time for our own headspace. In moderation, right? It can be useful. But when we're isolated in that addicted, active addiction headspace, that's deeply unhealthy and it's a
yeah,
downward spiral. So having that connection and like even for, if you're a loved one, a family member listening to this, like you have common humanity with the person in your life who has a gambling problem, whether they're still in active addiction or if they're in early recovery, long-term recovery. You have common humanity because you have suffered, they have suffered, you experience good days and bad days, you
yeah,
experience low mood, you experience anxiety, you experience worry, all these things. Like we've so much, you're saying 90% of the stories overlap, but like 90% of our common humanity probably overlaps. This is why,
yeah,
like, all these kind of scam artists, mind readers, and people who read your palm and all this sort of stuff, and even the gambling industry and marketing companies, they know something that we often as individuals don't know. As we think as individuals, we're all super unique, and marketing companies love to tell us that we're all super unique, right? When in reality, they know that we share common humanity, which means that they can market something to millions of people, tell them that they're all super unique, knowing full well that they're because they have all these shared, cognitive biases and all these different things that are part of our common humanity, X amount of those million people are going to buy the product,
yeah.
right? And still believe that they're super unique,
I
right?
also connected to that emotion as well. Timing and emotion. It could be 10 o'clock at night, you need a new car. We'll put a, yeah, and we could go off on a tangent here about how the gambling industry use all these techniques
Yeah,
to, so we don't, we've already covered that, I'm sure, but I'm sure we'll come back to it again,
yeah,
especially as I work through that book I mentioned last week.
yeah. So like our common humanity is there like that. It's the palm reader who tells you, oh you're fighting with one of your siblings, or one of your parents was angry with you as a child or whatever the thing is. Just global stuff that is true for most of the
Yeah,
population, right? You just throw enough of that stuff out there, like, oh my God, this person can read my mind. Or you see it in I've seen this a lot in counseling sessions, and especially gambling or when I used to specialize more in anxiety, you kind of describe a situation, that happens to most people most of the time, and the person
yeah,
goes, "Oh my God, it's like you're reading my mind." No, I'm not reading your mind. This is our
yeah,
common humanity, right? You put people in certain situations, gambling industry knows very well. You put people in certain situations, and the majority of them will respond in really predictable ways because we have this common stuff among all of us, right? So, I think for loved ones, we'd, talk to family members in the helpline or we'd work with family members in counseling sometimes as well. They really struggle with this idea of how could my partner have done this? Like, why do they keep throwing good money after bad? Why do they keep the secrets? Why did they not come to me earlier in the day when we could have done something, about it earlier in the day and it would have been less of a problem? And all these big question marks there. And that's an isolating effect that has I feel isolated from this other person. I don't understand them. I don't understand why they could have done all these things. But if you had found yourself in some of the situations in which they had found themselves, there's a pretty good chance you could have ended up in a similar place,
mm,
right? Pretty good chance because we share common humanity. Right? And I suppose that's the important part to remember because, couples can often kind of become very, very isolated from each other
yeah,
after, before the gambling comes out because the person within an active addiction is always isolating
mhm,
anyway. And then after the gambling comes out, there's a huge piece of work there to try and get the connection, the original connection that the two people had
yeah.
back to where it was. Like it's a massive piece of work.
Yeah, if we could find a formula for explaining, as you said, that common humanity, if you could find a way of explaining the whole mindset of the gambler in a way that the family member can relate to in certain situation in their life, it might make it easier for them to understand the gambling. Because like I think if you ask any person recovering from gambling, I think a lot of us kind of like I often question myself, how did I let it get that far? Why couldn't I stop? And again, you look at the whole psychology behind it, which we've touched on overall many episodes. It's the not want to reach out for help or not look or not being able to reach out for help. It's like that shame, the stigma, the belief that you can win the money back, the belief that big bets are in the corner. If we touch on this and change your thinking, the episode will be done on that. I think a lot of fan members will be looking at from their internal frame of reference of how they see gambling as that, oh, I put 5 around the Grand National once a year.
Mm.
But a person with a gambling addiction, may have used it as a way to cope with stress, with anxiety, boredom, whatever else might be. And other people might, like I've talked about a lot of time that in recovery, the shopping thing has kind of replaced the gambling a little bit. I've talked about this many times, and it's kind of like I was, last couple of weeks I had a bit of a tough week, and I was like, buy, buy, buy. It was like I saw Celtic playing up. I was online buying a Celtic tracksuit. I don't even support Celtic. I connected to it's not that I don't support them. I wouldn't be a huge,
Mm.
avid follower of them as well. Like it was like even in Dublin the other day, I was like, buy, buy, buy. And I was kind of going, Jesus Christ, like what? And I had to kind of take myself back. What's going on that I'm turning to this? And a lot of people will can kind of relate to coping skills that we might use gambling for, like, in shopping or whatever else it might be. But if we can find a way to explain all this to the wider family member, not kind of keep it to specific gambling examples, it might give people a better understanding of that mindset you just described of, like I have to keep going, I can't stop. Like, because it's something I still struggle with. Like we walk in the street and start shaking my head kind of going like, why couldn't I stop? Because I didn't know how to look for help. I didn't know. I thought I could get my way out, but it get to a point where you just go over that edge and that's it. There's no back. It's just like it's free fall from there. I hope I'm making sense. I feel like I'm rambling a bit, but
Yeah,
that piece, if we can get it, and again, that's why it's so important that we're talking about all of this to give understanding, because there could be family members who will listen to this and totally disagree with everything I'm saying or totally disagree with everything you're saying, but that's okay as long as it started the
yeah,
conversations around it, because it is that's the bit, because that can you can struggle most. You've gone recovery, you've done all the work yourself, you come out with treatment or out with your 12 sessions of counseling or out with GA meeting, and the other person is still stuck in that place. It's very hard for them to have compassion because they're still dealing with the fallout of it in lots of cases, managing finances in lots of cases as well, and it's very hard for that. There's a disconnect, or even imbalance in that relationship, and if we could find a way to kind of um, get that back in sync, it can go a long way to recovery for everyone in that situation.
yeah. We better get on to the last point before we run out of time here altogether. The last point that Kristin Neff makes in this self-compassion model is mindfulness versus over-identification. And we touched on this a little bit at the start, so this thing, intense emotion flares up. There might be from a bridging effect, that kind of touches back on things that happened to us earlier in our life. Could be, big T traumas, small T traumas. Um, and then if there is that bridging effect back to past stuff, something that's happening in the present that might be relatively small, from the outside looking in, becomes very big because it's activating what we spoke about earlier on. Maybe we'll come into that in more detail another day, what they'd call an exile part, something
Mm.
from back often in childhood, not always. Pattern matches to that, bridges to that, and then boom. Now
Yep.
this thing that might, from the outside looking in, be considered a small thing because of its connection to past things, flares up, right? So now we're outside of our emotional window of tolerance that you talked about earlier on. We're in emotional dysregulation. And I think what she's talking about here, well, you've made up notes, you're gonna might have to correct me here. With the over identification, we start going, oh, this is typical me. I can't handle a small bit of stress and I can't handle criticism. And hey, where's that baseball bat? And boom, 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 and the judgment
Or
kicks
someone else
in.
can tell you this is
Yeah,
typical you, this is
yeah,
typical reaction.
yeah,
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 it's
yeah. Yeah. And somebody saying it's typical you, that's if you're in a well-adjusted place, you can take that on the chin and you
Yeah,
can say, you know what, that's a fair comment. I have responded like this in the past, and this is something I'm working on, and thank
yeah.
you for your feedback, right? That might be a well-adjusted place. If you're not in a well-adjusted place, that's petrol on the flames, man.
But
Like
if you're
that's
triggered in that moment, you're not going
yeah,
to think that rationally.
yeah.
I think we'll say something happened last week where I felt criticized and I went off on a tangent. I remember like I even as I was in that role and I just went and I kind of went, this reaction is so far removed from the situation. But I knew then on reflection, or even I kind of reflected afterwards. I knew that it was again that bridge effect based on the criticism I would have given myself as a younger person, or the criticism I would have felt at home as a younger person. No, not that it was anything major, but it was that I was triggered by something happened in the present and it very much brought me back. And the reaction was so over the top for what the thing was. And it's on reflection. And then the whole thing of that self-loathing, that isolation comes in, and they're going to go like, why did I react to that? What's wrong with me? I'm 15 years in recovery. I should be able to. I'm a counselor. I should be able to regulate emotion, but I'm a human as well. And in that moment, it's very hard to take that step back out. And again, we'll use the analogy of hit the wall of frustration. In that moment, you can't stop yourself. You're not thinking about the consequences of your actions. And a lot of times in arguments, in normal arguments with our family members, friends, partners, our brain saying, don't say what you're going to say, don't say what you're going to say. And then you blurt it out. Remember that argument 4 years ago and you said this then. And
Mhm.
afterwards, like you beat yourself over, bring it up. But in that moment, it's like a self-protection thing, isn't it? You're going on the attack because you feel like you're being attacked. And again, it's human conditioning. But it's that whole thing of being able, it's very difficult to catch yourself in that moment. That's why we're saying like emotional regulation is you go outside your window tolerance, there's an argument. Usually someone goes out the door and bangs the door and walks away. And even that space gives you time to come back down and think rationally. Whereas if you're constantly playing the argument over your head, you isolate yourself, you start going into that whole, we used to call it stinking thinking in Italian, all this
Mhm.
kind of stuff they used to call it. Um, you start ruminating more and more. Next thing it comes up, and next thing you're packing your bags in your own brain. I'm leaving, I'm going, I'm never coming back. And you're preparing for life without partners or wives, husbands, whatever it might be. So it's important to, again, when we are triggered in that moment, especially with the bridge effect that you mentioned, is to separate yourself from the situation, come back in, try get back into that window tolerance between those two kind of lines, your window tolerance, and think rationally, or think more, not think rationally, think more rationally, so that you can calm yourself a little bit more, use all the skills. And this is firefighting at its finest, I think,
Mhm.
because then you can look at the situation with a different set of eyes. And then to have, for me, it's about having the humility, which I think is mentioned a lot as well, to kind of say, you know what, I got it wrong there. I did react because it was this. And then to take that learning into the next thing and to have very much open conversations with whoever it was that the situation arose in. Because what can happen is it gets pushed under the carpet, we make up, we don't fully look at what's the triggering event, like the small
Mhm.
T trauma, big T trauma, as you mentioned. I think if we can get more of an understanding on that, when we are triggered in that moment, you might be able to catch yourself a little bit better saying, oh, this is very similar to the last time. And without that reaction of bringing up arguments from 15 years ago, 16 years ago, and throwing everything. I don't know if that makes sense the way in
Yeah.
that, but that
Yeah.
mindfulness piece, I think, is it's a very important situation. I'm thinking that suicide or survive course. If anyone got a chance to go to, it's one of the best courses I was ever. It's all about mindfulness. It's not about suicide. And they'll say like take a minute 5 times a day. That's all. It's just
Mhm.
just take yourself out for 5 minutes. That for men, it's going to the bathroom a lot of time, I think, and sitting reading the back of the shampoo bottle. But even that, like, it's just about not engage in phone because there's a lot of stuff on there that'll just wind you up anyway. But just to take that moment, just kind of go right, ground myself for a few minutes. And if you can constantly build that into your day, it means that when you are triggered, we've talked about this already at the start. It'll mean that when you are triggered, because we are triggered many times during the day, during the week, we might be able to not react in as much as we normally would. And that, I think that's the learning. And that we build up our own, to go right back to the start, we build up our own self-compassion, our own self-forgiveness there, our own self-worth. But also it shows the other person, the other side of the recovery, like a partner, a loved one, that we're acting in different ways rather than having an argument going out to the bookies, storming out. That's what we would have done to get bets on. Switching off into our phones, like would have been for gambling as well. So I think if we can use all the stuff, and I would advise anyone to go on and do the test, go on and look at there's only a couple of short videos, which are so delighting. I was looking at the videos, kind of, they're only a minute long, and to kind of to get that sense of it, because we're only basically touching, we probably come back to it again, I'm sure. But I think it's a really self-compassion, self-worth, self-forgiveness is a huge part of recovery. It's about stopping gambling. It's about learning how to like ourselves again. I've often said that. And if we can, a lot of the stuff that Kristin Neff talks about is that. Another person we didn't mention, that Paul Gilbert has a great book called The Compassionate Mind, and there's
Yeah.
a really good workbook accompanying as well. And again, I remember reading it at a time where I was going through that. I was going through a bad time in early recovery, and I can't remember what the book, because I was reading it just looking for something. I'll go back to it again on the back of all this, because I think it's a very, very important part of recovery, but also a very important part of life as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and just I know you need to go there, but just before we finish up, like there's a great he's not for everybody, but I love his a lot of his stuff. This kind of Zen philosopher, English guy, big in the '60s, Alan Watts. He's one of these kind of Jeremy Irons
Too young
types.
for them, too young
So-
to remember that very story.
It's on YouTube, Tony. It's on YouTube. But anyway, he talks, it's kind of Zen philosopher type, but a lot of it is just mindfulness based, essentially, before they started using the term mindfulness. But he talks about the emotional world and even thoughts as just being stuff happening. It's just
Yeah.
stuff happening, right? Now, the problem is, and I think this is something she's touching on here in this model, is the over-identification. We go, no, but it's stuff happening to me,
Mm,
right? It's not just stuff happening, it's stuff happening to me. And
mm,
rather than like that mindful thing, there's a mindfulness practice is a challenge for people in the West because it's not part of our culture and it's not something we're brought up to do, but it is something that is doable to be able to take a little bit of a step back and go, okay, no, it's just a thought, right?
yeah.
It's just some sensations in the body, and I associate those sensations with discomfort, intense discomfort, and I feel like I can't cope with them. But it's just your heart rate is a little bit faster, maybe you're hyperventilating a little bit, because you're anxious. Again, there are breathing exercises you can do that'll turn that around very, very quickly, right?
Yeah.
And it's the over-identification with, these physical sensations are happening to me, and then can get us into fight or flight and all these
Yeah.
different cascading effects of all these things rather than just going, it's just stuff happening. I can tolerate
Yeah.
it. I've tolerated stuff like this before many, many times. I'm still standing. I'm here. I'm alive. I'm
Yeah.
breathing.
100%. Yeah.
Now, it takes a bit of practice to do that, right?
Yes.
Like everything,
Yes.
right? Okay, we
Yes.
better wind it
We
up
might,
there
yeah,
for
we,
today.
we might touch back on it again next week and might maybe talk about the emotional regulation piece. I think
Yeah,
it'd be a nice piece
yeah.
to do. Yeah, I enjoyed that conversation. I didn't know where it was going to go. It's good to, I think it's a very, very important part of anyone's journey in life, but also especially in recovery because it is self-compassion. It's especially in gambling recovery, I think, because there is I believe sometimes it can be a lot more of a fallout financially or longer term fallout than other addictions. Now, maybe I'm wrong. People might argue otherwise, but I think that debt legacy and that financial impact can accentuate all this stuff that we talk about because it's there visually for years,
Mm.
and constant reminders every time you go onto your bank app or go on or want to book a holiday or whatever else might be. I think that can really hamper a lot of this stuff, both for yourself and loved one.
Yeah, and the lies and the secrecy and the
Yeah,
breach of trust,
all that. Yeah,
all of that stuff
yeah.
feeds into it.
We might come back to it next week, maybe
Yeah.
part one of two.
Okay.
If you get me on again next week,
Brilliant.
brilliant.
All right, sir. I'll let you go. Thank you, listener or viewer, for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time. Bye.